Good morning, and welcome to the Museum of the San Ramon Valley's virtual speaker series. I'm Dan Dunn, the director of the museum. Today is the 11th presentation in this series. We're closing in on a year. Past presentations have included the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, California's First People, Then and Now, the Alamo Pioneer Cemetery, and last month, Camp Park's role during World War II. Our presentation today is entitled John Muir, California's Most Famous Resident. Our presenter is Garrett Daly, an attorney, noted authority on John Muir, and I'm happy to say a museum member for our museum in the San Ramon Valley. Garrett is a resident of Alamo and a part-time resident of Scotland. He has taught a course on John Muir at the University of Edinburgh. We know Muir as a conservationist and his role in preserving Yosemite. Maybe we even visited his home in Martinez, but he was far more than that, as Garrett will tell us. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in your questions anytime during the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. This presentation is a bit longer than our usual. It's about an hour in length. I certainly think you'll enjoy this hour, but if you need to leave early, you can watch the recorded version, which will be on the museum website early next week. And now to our presentation. It's my great pleasure to introduce Garrett Daly.
Thank you very, very much. Hello, and let me get this started. Go. Welcome to what John Muir would have called my scribble den. Let me start by just saying cheers to my friends in Scotland who have dropped by to learn a little bit more about their own native son. To me, it's really appropriate that this presentation be part of the San Ramon Valley Museum's library, because after all, John Muir lived the last half of his life 19 miles from here. You can't go but a short distance in any direction without finding something significant named for John Muir. Our main hospital is John Muir Medical Center. Just a short drive away, we have, of course, Muir Woods. We have, Muir Beach. Literally just yesterday, I went to my mailbox and there's a solicitation from the John Muir Land Trust seeking donations to preserve some local wilderness. And our discussion really couldn't be any more timely, because April 21st, next Wednesday, is John Muir Day in California. If you're wondering how many other Californians have been so honored, the answer is only two: Harvey Milk and Ronald Reagan. Now, when I call him California's most famous resident, that is not hyperbole. It's the result of a statewide poll conducted by the California Historical Society. And the also-rans in that poll included people like Walt Disney, John Steinbeck, William Randolph Hearst, and Father, now Saint Junipero Serra. It's also significant that every state got to design a quarter that said what they felt was special about their state. Hawaii, they put a king on theirs. Illinois, a president. Texas, well, Texas put Texas. California, we put a Scot. This is the California quarter. And it says to the world what we think is most special about our state. Of course, the crown jewel is got to be Yosemite National Park and Yosemite Valley. So we have Yosemite Valley and we have Half Dome. We have the California condor, the giant sequoia, and a Scot, John Muir. So here's what has always intrigued me about John Muir, and that is this. Here's a man of modest means. He never held public office, lived much of his life in the wilderness, and yet somehow has been able to become or was able to become one of the most influential people in the last 150 years. So when my wife and I live in Scotland, we try to absorb and find out what it is that engendered this. Not just John Muir, but many famous Americans were really Scottish immigrants, including people like Andrew Carnegie. We call him Carnegie, but he called himself Carnegie. The Scots call him Carnegie. Alexander Graham Bell, David Dunbar Buick, the founder of Buick Motors, and many others were part of this mass migration that took place in the 19th century to the United States. And I'm going to let John Muir set the stage for my story. And this is in his autobiography, well, quasi-autobiography, Story of My Boyhood and Youth. He wrote it, but he was in his 70s when he did it, and only covers the first 20 years of his life or so. But he said, when I was a boy in Scotland, I was fond of everything that was wild. And all my life, I've been growing fonder and fonder of wild places and wild creatures. He's born April 21st in 1838 in Dunbar, Scotland. Dunbar, about 30 miles from Edinburgh. He's the third of 8 children of Daniel and Anne Muir. This is what Dunbar would have looked like when John Muir lived there. Interestingly enough, it doesn't look all that much different today. It's a delightful town. This is not the house in which John Muir was born, but it is a house at the location where he was born. They have turned it into a delightful free museum. I was talking to the proprietor there, or really the docent, and we started talking, of course, about John Muir, and I told him that I lived a few miles from his home. Anyway, he told me the inside story about the museum, and that is that Dunbar had so many Americans coming, inquiring about John Muir. The Scots, being the good business people that they are, realized they had a tourist attraction there, so they put up a museum. Kind of across the street from it, catty corner, is this wonderful, whimsical statue of what John Muir might have looked like as a young lad, age 11, when he left for the New World. Now, part of his upbringing, there's really 2 major forces in his early years that will play on John Muir. One is the school in Scotland. This is part of what framed him. Scotland is at this time one of the poorest countries in Europe, and yet it has perhaps certainly the finest public education system in Europe, perhaps even in the world. There's a long story as to how that happens. It goes all the way back to the 16th century with the Calvinist preacher, reformer John Knox. But anyway, John Muir will attend school in Scotland from age 3 to 11. Now, teaching in Scotland was quite stern. If you didn't memorize your lessons as you were supposed to, you didn't get a time out. Muir, in his own words, said, quote, "The whole educational system was founded on leather." But he got a wonderful foundation. By age 11, he is able to memorize and master the rules of grammar of English, Latin, and French. As you'll see, by the time he enters the University of Wisconsin, that foundation is going to be absolutely crucial. Now, the other major force that acts on Muir during his childhood is his father, John. The slide said that John was intensely religious. That is perhaps an understatement. He was fanatical. And, Daniel Muir was absolutely fanatical. He bounces around from church to church. He tries the Church of Scotland. He tries other churches. He finally finds a home with the Disciples of Christ. But his interpretation of the Bible and what was required to to become more in tune with Christ, were his practices were cruel and harsh. Three of Muir's siblings will be uh, injured, will have ill effects of their childhood for life because of the treatment they receive um, from their father. Um, Now, John is forced by Daniel to memorize large portions of the Bible. Now, reputedly, he has a photographic memory, which certainly helps. He memorizes the entire New Testament from the Gospel of Matthew all the way through Revelations, and he can recite that back verbatim from memory 50 years later. He also memorizes large portions of the Old Testament. Now, in 1848, remember, he's age 11. Daniel comes home one day and announces that, boys, you need not finish your lessons today because we're moving to America in the morning. By the way, that sounds a whole lot better when somebody with a Scottish accent says these lines. But anyway, this comes as a surprise to his wife, who is not even consulted about this. Now, across the street from the Muirs on High Street are the Gilrays, which are Anne's family here, Anne's parents. And the father, Mr. Gilray, her father, pretty much stayed out because he and Daniel had intense disagreements about religion, but he put his foot down at this point and said, "You're not taking my daughter to the New World until you at least know where you're going, you have a home and a place for them." And so Daniel agrees, and he and the three older children leave in 1849, and they sail from Glasgow to the New World. This is part of, up until that time, the greatest migration in human history. What's going on in 1849? Well, let's start with the most obvious, the California Gold Rush. 200,000 Scots will leave during this period and move to the United States. In addition to that, you have the Great Hunger, the potato famine going on in Ireland and in Scotland. You have the remnants of the Highland clearances going back to the Jacobites. All of this is combining to contributing to this mass migration. But that's not why the Muirs are moving. Daniel is a successful shopkeeper in Dunbar. Why would he give that up to move to the New World? The answer is because he wants religious freedom and he wants land, both of which were in short supply in Scotland at that time. So he ends up in Wisconsin. Now, how does he end up in Wisconsin? Well, he actually is headed for Canada, but on the boat, talking to another disciple of Christ, he's convinced that no, Wisconsin is the place to go. You have lots of Scots, lots of great land, and lots of disciples. So that's where they end up. Now, this is what the United States looked like in 1850. Remember, they're there in 1849. And you can see that Wisconsin is right on the verge of the West. It's pretty much the Wild West out there at this time. Wisconsin had only become a state the year before. The Army had only abandoned Fort Winnebago there to protect settlers from Indians 3 years before. And to put this into chronological context, the Battle of the Little Bighorn won't occur for another 30 years. All right, Daniel buys a farm. That's what he wants to do. He wants land. Unfortunately, he didn't know a thing about farming. Before he was a shopkeeper, he was a recruiting sergeant in the British Army. He doesn't know a thing about farming. But he's told by people that, oh, you got to have lots of hardwood. So he chooses some land that he buys that is abundant with hard timber, but has very poor soil, which is a problem if you're going to be a farmer. And within a few years, it's exhausted by farming. This is what the farm would have looked like. This is John Muir's drawing of, they called it Fountain Lake Farm. Now, to Daniel's credit, he built the family quite a spacious, relatively, lovely home. Only problem is that the only room that was heated was the kitchen, and that was from this stove. But anyway, this is where John Muir lived from age 11 for a number of years. The first year he was there, he was in heaven because he was really too young to work the farm. So he was out exploring, looking at nature, animals, playing in the wilderness. But by age 12, now he's expected to carry his weight. He works from sunup to sundown on the farm. And I mean, he's plowing, he's driving the horses, he's helping to clear the land, cut down the trees, pull up the stumps, harvest, and so on and so forth. Literally sunup to sundown. He wants to get an education. The problem is that there's only one book allowed in the Muir household, and of course it's the Bible. Now, he has neighbors nearby, relatively nearby, that are also Scots that have an extensive library and are willing to loan him books. So John keeps sneaking these books into the house and reading them when he can. Daniel won't permit outside books, but fortunately his mother and sisters help him hide them. Well, his father finds one of the books and is very angry. He calls the novel the spawn of Satan, the devil's own book of lies. By the way, what he found wasn't a Playboy. It was actually Sir Walter Scott, one of the Waverley novels, which today we, of course, consider to be classics. Well, eventually, Daniel gives in because he knows that his son is going to read, and there's not much he can do about it. But the question is, when is John going to get to read? They're up at the crack of dawn. They eat. They're out in the fields. They work until time for supper. They come in. They have supper, evening prayers, and then it's time for bed at 9 o'clock. So John's, always trying to scam 5 or 10 minutes to read. That annoys Daniel. So Daniel finally says, if you will read, get up as early as you want in the morning, and you can read as much as you want. So John starts getting up at 1 a.m. to read. That gives him, a full 5 hours to read. To him, that's heaven. Now, the question is this. He's been working all day in the fields. He's exhausted. He goes to bed at 9. How is he able to get up at 1 in the morning? They don't have alarm clocks. How is he able to do that? I'll come back to that. Anyway, John discovers early on that he has this innate talent as an inventor. He starts working with pieces of wood, which he'll carve with a knife. He'll grab scraps of metal, pieces of wire, and he begins making things. And he actually has a workshop in the house where he works on his inventions. Now, the first invention he comes up with is one very useful, and that's a self-setting sawmill. Now, this is what it would have looked like. This is his drawing of it. Interestingly enough, he comes up with this idea on his own. Well, 2 years earlier, someone in another part of the United States got a patent for designing a machine just like this. Muir came up with it on his own. His early inventions are quite remarkable. He invents a double rotary saw, a combination door lock, remarkable clocks. The most interesting one of which is called the early rising machine. And this answers the question I posited just a minute ago, is how was he able to get up at 1 a.m. after only 4 hours sleep? And the answer is he invents a clock that is an alarm clock in the extreme. I don't have a picture. I wish I did. But just try to imagine. Okay, you have his twin bed, narrow bed. Imagine you hinged the two lower legs to the floor. You put clamps on the upper two legs. You put a pulley connected to a weight. And then John invents a clock that is an alarm clock that at exactly 1 a.m. will release the clamps on the bed, the pulleys and the weight now will pull the bed vertical, and he goes flying across the room. Needless to say, he had no trouble waking up. So among the inventions that he has, again, these are his drawings, is a working barometer, this amazing clock with its star hand, a working thermometer, all of these made with scraps. He couldn't go down to the hardware store or down to Radio Shack or something, pick up the parts. These were all made with scraps of metal and wood in his little workshop. Now, what's Daniel's reaction to this? You think he'd be quite proud. His reaction is, I wish you were half as zealous in your study of religion. Well, in 1860, a friend of John says, look, John, you got to go. You got to take these inventions and show them at the state agricultural fair in Madison. John agrees. He thinks that's a great idea. He prepares to leave home for the first time. So what are his parents' reactions? His dad refuses to even say goodbye. His mom slips John a gold coin. So he's off to Madison. It's 1860. He's 22. He's never been to a big city before other than passing through Glasgow, but he's never been on his own in a big city. He shows up at the fair, shows them his inventions. They welcome him in. They give him a booth or a little space where he can exhibit them. Now, you would expect that this would kind of be a laughingstock. These are handmade inventions. John is there in his clothes that his mother has made, so handmade clothes. The state fair in Madison is the social event of the year. Women are there in their finery, their fine hats. Men are there in their suits. And here's this kid from the country with his handmade clothes and these inventions. Well, guess what? Turns out he is a sensation. The papers look at his inventions. They are enthralled. People love them. The early rising machine is a sensation. The description is that you have his little stall there. You have people lined up down the aisle, out the door of the tent, and around, everybody coming up wanting to take a turn in the early rising machine. So they would reset it. He would set the clock for 2 minutes. It would go off. It would go vertical. The person go flying across the tent. The next, they put it down, and the next person. The thermometer that he demonstrated, now I can't even imagine this, was made out of a washboard. It was allegedly so sensitive that when you approached it, the hand would rise because it could sense your body heat. The local papers dub him a boy genius. Crowds throng to see his inventions. He wins a $15 honorarium. None of that's important. What is important is among the people that come to see his inventions are people from professors from the University of Wisconsin, including Professor Ezra and Gene Carr. Now, Gene Carr will be his mentor, his sponsor, his muse for the rest of his life. She's one of the two most important women in his life, people in his life, and she will help guide his career. He also meets the dean of the University of Wisconsin. Now, he left school in Dunbar at age 11. When he was on the farm with Daniel, he was able to attend the local school for maybe 3 months. That's it. That's his formal education. Well, he decides that he would like to go to the university. Now, can you imagine the chutzpah of this kid, going, make an appointment with the dean and saying, I want to come. Well, the dean, first of all, saw his invention. Secondly, gets to talk to him, realizes what he's dealing with there. And guess what? He is admitted into the university. Now, John will call this being, this is the kingdom of heaven as far as he's concerned, because his whole life is his father, not his whole life, but his father, very, very restrictive. And yet here he can study whatever he wants. And he has access to this incredible volume of knowledge. He is recognized even today as one of the University of Wisconsin's most talented engineering students ever. You would also think that he would be teased at the university. Again, a kid from the country in handmade clothes, so on. No, it turns out he is enormously popular, and he continues with his inventions, and people are constantly coming to his dorm room wanting to see them. One of which, by the way, survives. It is on display at the University of Wisconsin. This is his study desk. Now, I have no idea how it works, but apparently the books would be stacked, his school books would be stacked up. One would drop down onto that wheel, would turn over. He would then sit in front of him. He'd have 15 minutes to study it, and then the book would move off and another one would drop down. Anyway, this is quite high, and you can see it at the university even today. His time at the university, truly transformational. He's an engineering student, but he spends and becomes fascinated by geology and by botany. He spends a lot of time with the Carr family, with Professor Ezra and Jean Carr. Professor Carr has a wonderful library, and while and John will study and read books while there. He becomes fascinated by Professor Louis Agassiz's theories on glaciation and the effect that they have on geology and topography. Professor Agassiz, his books are scientific treatises, and they are in French. Guess what? No problem for John Muir, because by age 11, remember, he had memorized the rules of grammar of French, so he was able to read these scientific treatises in another language. He begins to study the natural world, like I say, becoming fascinated by the zoology and botany. He also becomes and starts reading, becomes familiar with the works of Thoreau and Emerson, the two leading naturalists of the 19th century, before Muir anyway. One of the things that he learns to do is to emulate Emerson's Commonplace book. From that moment on, Muir will always have a journal with him in which he will record his thoughts, his impressions. He'll diagram what he sees. These journals are priceless, and with the exception of the ones that, well, I'll tell you about in a second, that were lost, virtually all of them survive. The originals are in a collection at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, and a complete set of them are available, copies at the library in Edinburgh. Many of the books that are attributed to John Muir are really, I don't want to say nothing but, because that's are really edited versions and compilations of his contemporaneous writings in his journal. Now, this is a funny story I just have to share with you, because again, gives you insight into his background. This is 1863 and is the first picture ever taken of anybody of the Muir family. Why no pictures before that? Daniel believed that they were graven images, so they were absolutely forbidden. Well, John sends this picture to his mom and Anne, and Anne, of course, she loves it, and she hides it. Unfortunately, Daniel finds it, but when he found it, he was only mildly disapproving. He didn't throw the tantrum that everyone expected. And that sort of gave a green light. And the rest of the Muir family, they all ran out and got their pictures taken too. John was only at the University of Wisconsin for 2.5 years. What else is going on in the early 1860s? The Civil War. And John, despite being Scottish, is firmly a pacifist. He doesn't want any part of the war. Many of his university friends and other students have gone off and signed up. Well, his number did not come up in the draft of the first 2 years. One of his brothers had taken off to Canada, and so that's what John does as well. So he does what many of my contemporaries did 100 years later, and that is went to Canada to avoid an unpopular war. Now, each place he goes, he has no trouble getting a job, no trouble meeting people. He's an incredibly talented engineer and inventor and machinist. So each place he goes, he gets a job. He immediately begins to make changes in the factory, invents some wonderful labor-saving devices. In Canada, he worked with the Trout family and other Scots, of course, and they were making broom handles and wooden rakes. And Muir invented a machine for them where they were able to make a year's worth of rakes in a few weeks using his machines. Unfortunately, the factory where he is burned down, where he was living, burned down. With it were lost his journals up until that time. Anyway, the Trouts offered him a partnership if he would stay. He turned him down, moved back to the United States to Indianapolis. There he gets a job with a company making wagon wheels. These were for bespoke carriages. They were being made by hand. Muir looks at it, says that's ridiculous, and invents a machine to assemble them automatically. You would wonder, with all of these machines he's inventing, these labor-saving machines, how many patents he holds. The answer is none. He didn't believe in that. He thought that these talents were gifts from God and he should not profit from them. So he never sought a patent on any of his inventions. In 1867 is one of the most fortuitous accidents that will ever happen. And that is, he's in Indianapolis, he's adjusting a large belt with a sharp file. The file slips and jabs him in his right eye. The trauma it causes him to immediately go blind in his right eye, and then sympathetic reaction, his left eye goes blind as well. He writes to Gene Carr, he said, "My right eye gone, closed forever to God's beauty." Well, the owner of the factory, although the local doctor said he was blind forever, they brought in an eye specialist who said, "No, I think you'll be fine. I think it will return." So after a few weeks or month of being in a dark room with covered, his sight slowly starts to return. He again writes, he says, "God has to nearly kill us sometimes to teach us lessons." Well, he decides at that point, despite the fact he is so talented as an inventor, a machinist, and so on, he decides he's going to devote himself to nature, and he begins what is called his 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf. Now, this isn't just a saunter; he has an objective. One of the people he studied at the University of Wisconsin was Alexander von Humboldt and Humboldt's explorations of South America. Muir his goal is to go to South America and continue the work of von Humboldt. Well, he leaves Minneapolis, takes a short train ride, and then takes a long saunter through the South, through the floweriest, leafiest, most deserted places he can find. Along the way, now the South in the late 1860s, is not a place you really want to be sauntering about. You have marauding ex-Confederate soldiers, you have marauding ex-slaves. He is held up a number of times. The adventures he has, absolutely delightful. At one point, he sleeps in a graveyard because he was told that the ex-slaves, freed slaves, were afraid of the graveyard, and so on. Anyway, when he finally, by the way, of course, he carries a journal with him. He carries a plant press, taking samples along the way. His journal famously is inscribed on the inside of the front cover, John Muir, and in his home, Earth, Planet, Universe. This is a diagram of the route that he takes, again, starting in Indianapolis and then ending in Savannah, taking a short boat ride, and then walking across the Florida to Cedar Keys. Along the way, he contracts malaria. It almost kills him. And he realizes that he is not strong enough to go to South America and continue the explorations down the Amazon and the Andes and the Orinoco. So instead, he goes for second place, which is he's heard about California and the Yosemite. So he takes a boat and he crosses the isthmus, and he ends up in San Francisco in 1868. This is what he would have looked like at that time. Now, San Francisco in 1868 is the Barbary Coast. It is wild. It is hectic. It's just crazy there. So this is something Muir not used to. So he gets off the boat. He realizes immediately he's got to get out of town. He grabs somebody off the street and he said, "What's the nearest way out of town?" And the person looks at him like he's crazy and says, "Where do you want to go?" Muir says, "To any place that is wild." Well, the stranger gives him, well, kind of the same advice you'd probably get if you ask a San Franciscan the same question today. Put him on a ferry to Oakland. So he crosses the bay, he hits Oakland, he hangs a right, walks down to Gilroy, cross the pass into the Central Valley. The Central Valley he describes as the floweriest piece of the world. He catches his first glimpse of the Sierra Nevada mountains. His reaction there is, it seems to me the Sierra should be called not the Nevada or Snowy Range, but the Range of Light. And then from there, he ascends into Yosemite Valley and into history. He is 30 years old. He will remain in the valley for 4 or 5 more years. First, he takes some odd jobs. The first one of any note is he's a sheep herder for Pat Delaney. He takes the sheep up to Tuolumne Meadows for the summer. He has an assistant, and that gives him lots of time to explore the Sierras around. One of the things he learns quickly is to intensely dislike sheep. He calls them hooven locusts because they basically destroy. They eat everything. They eat the natural fauna, the flowers. He detests sheep. That's going to be important later in his relationship with Yosemite. Later he's in the valley and he's running a sawmill for a man named James Hutchins. Hutchins is really the first tourist entrepreneur in Yosemite, runs a hotel there and is actively trying to get tourists to come into the valley. Muir also learns to dislike loggers. Why? Because what do loggers do? They cut down trees. So he runs a sawmill. You can see there's a problem there. He solves it by refusing to log anything, to mill anything other than a dead tree. Now, this period is marked by really intense investigation and exploration by Muir of the Yosemite Valley and the Sierras. He will act as a guide. He becomes quite renowned, and he'll act as a guide to very influential people. Now, how will these influential people know to look up somebody who runs a sawmill to guide them around? The answer is Jean Carr. Jean Carr and her husband, Professor Ezra, have now moved to California. They're living in Berkeley. He is now a professor at the University of California. Muir builds his first house in Yosemite. This is me sitting at the little monument that they have there for him, just at the base of Yosemite Falls. Pretty nice digs, if you think about it. while there, to him, the valley and the history of the valley is an open book. He sees it, he can see it, and he understands it, and it's just everywhere. Remember, he studied glaciation and the works of Professor Agassiz at the university. Now, as Muir wanders around, he sees the writing left by the glaciers everywhere. The moraines, only one way moraines can get there, glaciers. The erratics. Erratics are boulders that are that cannot have gotten there on their own. There's nothing above where they could have fallen from. They're left by retreating glaciers, and of course, glacial striation, a clear sign. And in his writings, he explains that every carpenter knows that only a dull tool will follow the grain of the wood. Such a tool is the glacier. Mighty as its effects appear to us, it has only developed the predestined forms of mountain beauty, which were ready and waiting to receive the baptism of light. By the way, you've got to read Muir in his own words. He describes everything in such a wonderful, poetic, clear way. He's the only person I know who can write a page on a dewdrop and have it spellbinding. That's how clear and crisp his powers of observation are. In 1871, he publishes his first article, Yosemite Glaciers, and to his shock, the New York Tribune pays him $200, a princely sum, to publish the article. And Muir begins to realize he might actually be able to make a living doing that. So he then begins to write a series of articles for Overland magazine called Studies in the Sierras. These are all well received, and he begins to be asked to write additional articles and even books. Now, one problem that he has is that his theory of glaciation runs exactly counter to accepted wisdom. Josiah Whitney is a professor of geology at Harvard and California State geologist. Josiah Whitney, the namesake for Mount Whitney. By the way, Mount Whitney was not named for Josiah Whitney. Josiah Whitney named Mount Whitney after himself. He has actually said, gee, that's the tallest mountain. I think I'll name it after myself. That you can't do that anymore, but that's literally how it got its name. Anyway, he wrote the definitive book on Yosemite called the Yosemite Guidebook, and in it he theorized that Yosemite was the result of a cataclysmic earthquake that split the earth and the valley fell. Well, we now know that that's absolutely wrong. Muir vehemently disagreed with that. Like I said, he could see the signs of glacial activity everywhere. Whitney, not pleased to be contradicted, dismisses Muir as a mere sheep herder, calls him wrong and incompetent, and Whitney denies that there were ever any glaciers in the valley at all. Well, Muir is able to prove that wrong because in his explorations, he will actually find dozens of living glaciers in the Sierras. Now, what would you think that John's father would think, Daniel Muir, over this? His son is now being published nationally, is gaining fame, gaining notoriety. You'd think he'd be proud. You'd be wrong. He denounces John's studies as worthless, godless, and unnecessary, and instead sends his son a religious tract and says, nature is the handiwork of God, not glaciers, and your studies and your writings are a dangerous distraction from God. He says to John, you cannot warm the heart of God with your cold, icy top mountains. Come back to the church and God's holy word. Leave glaciers and nature behind. Burn your writings so that they will do no harm to you or to others. And then he signs the letter, your affectionate father in Christ. Are you kind of getting an idea of John's upbringing? Anyway, John, again, is still the running the sawmill. And yet this stream of really important people will come up to see him, to be guided. One of which is the professor of geology at the University of California, Joseph LeConte. A lot of things named for LeConte in Berkeley. He calls Muir the most passionate lover of nature. Professor Runkle is the professor of MIT. After being guided around by Muir, he offers Muir a professorship at the university. Muir respectfully declines. Louis Agassiz, the person who literally wrote the book on glaciation, travels to San Francisco with the intent of being guided through Yosemite by Muir. Unfortunately, he's too ill to make the journey, but nevertheless, we'll say that Muir is the one person in the world who truly, truly understands glaciers, and the person that was most meaningful to Muir up until this time, his idol, Ralph Waldo Emerson. At this point, Emerson is the strongest voice for naturalism in the country. Unfortunately, Emerson, when he makes the trip, also is, shall we say, in the twilight of his years. He comes to Yosemite, spends several days with Muir, but Muir really wants to take Emerson camping in the sequoias and really let him experience it. Unfortunately, Emerson was unable to do that, but they will correspond for the rest of Emerson's life. Now, when Muir would go camping in the Sierras, he didn't take a backpack full of gear, sleeping bags, and so on. He would wear his woolen jacket, his woolen pants. His shoes were hobnailed, where he would nail, literally put nails in them. And he would explore for days with nothing but a piece of stale bread and tea and something to cook it in. He's credited with most of the first ascents of California's major peaks, credited to John Muir. When you read his books about his adventures in the Sierras, many of them are truly, truly amusing and entertaining, and great humility as he writes them. In 1872, he's in Yosemite, and there's a massive earthquake with major rock falls. Now, most of the people are terrified and are running out of the valley. Muir is going the opposite direction, of course. He's running to the rock falls, and is reported to have said, cheer up, Mother Earth is only trotting us on her knees to amuse us and make us good. Now, the funny thing about this is that Lynn and I, my wife and I, were in a Yosemite Conservancy meeting in Yosemite, and we got guided around by the park geologist who is studying how to predict rock falls. And what the geologist told us was the most detailed, best firsthand account that to this day they have of a major rockfall in Yosemite was written by John Muir, because he took detailed notes and diagrams and explained what happened. Again, most detailed that they have, and here we are 150 years later. 1874, he completes his series studies in the Sierras. He goes and explores Mount Shasta. While up there, this gives you an idea of this and the next adventure of Muir and his view of nature. He's headed up Mount Shasta with a guide. A large storm is forming. The guide says, we got to go down, and Muir sends the guide down. He continues up, and a massive storm hits. Muir, without sleeping bags or even blankets, rides it out in the open, and he writes, wild wind and snow, drifts changing the outlines of mountains, pulsing outlines, 3 inches of snow on my blankets sifted into my hair, and it was a glorious, glorious storm. In the same adventure, a little later, he is, by the way, Shasta even today is a beautiful but still dangerous mountain. he's visiting a friend, and another storm is coming. He borrows a warm coat from her and a length of rope. He climbs up the tallest pine tree he can find and lashes himself to the top and rides out the storm. He says he clung to it like a bobolink on a reed. He writes to Jean Carr, "The pines are in ecstasy, and I feel I must go out to them." He wanted to experience nature in all its facets. Storms to him were not something that you run inside and hide from. You go out and experience it because it is pure nature. This gives you another some insight. The Donner Party. He viewed their experience as what happens when city people become alienated from nature. He says they were not good mountaineers. The whole winter could have been spent delightfully in so beautiful a spot. To him, that would have been heaven. Unfortunately, we know what happened, the tragedy of the Donner Party. Well, in 1873, Jean Carr finally is able to get him to leave Yosemite. And one of the reasons she wants him to be near San Francisco is she's got a match for him. There's somebody that she knows that she thinks is perfect for John Muir, and it's Louis or Louisa Carr. Strensel, daughter of John Strensel, a renowned physician and horticulturist who has a large farm in the Alhambra Valley. And Jean Carr is acting as the matchmaker and puts them together. Anyway, in 1875, Muir lived in the Bay Area, and he's busy writing articles. John, not the swiftest guy in the world, takes him 5 years to finally get around proposing to Louis. And so what does he do immediately afterwards? He heads off to Alaska. This is the first of 7 trips he will make to Alaska. This one incredibly memorable because there he will be credited with the discovery of Glacier Bay. And that's a wonderful adventure that he undertakes with the Native Americans in canoes, where they make the journey to, quote, discover Glacier Bay. On his many adventures there, and by the way, this could easily be a lecture series in its own of his 7 trips to Alaska. The Muir Glacier is named for him, and he would be the first to explore it. On one of his adventures, the third one there, or second one, he will have this wonderful adventure on the Taylor Glacier with a brave wee doggy named Stikeen. It's a absolutely delightful story. He will write a book about it called Stikeen, and it was enormously popular children's book back in the early 1900s. Well, in 1880, he and Louis finally marry. This is a picture of him taken a little later, but about what he would look like. They move in, he moves in to the Strensel farm. Dr. Strensel and his wife build a beautiful, beautiful mansion in the Alhambra Valley. It costs $20,000, which is a princely sum back then. It's Victorian, 10,000 feet, very modern, even had indoor plumbing. The Strensel property consisted of over 2,600 acres of farmland, absolutely gorgeous. This is what the house would have looked like in 1890. This is it today, where you can visit it. If you haven't been, please go. It is a wonderful, wonderful experience. John and Louis have 2 children, 2 daughters. The first one, Annie Wanda, known as Wanda, she's born the year after they're married. Wanda is a very robust daughter, fun-loving, and she will give them a grandchildren. The second child is Helen. She's born about 5 years later. Unfortunately, she was never in particularly good health. she and her husband will have 4 children. So between Helen and Wanda, the Muirs have 12 grandchildren. Funny story about Helen is she marries Buell Funk, and so she becomes Helen Funk, and their 4 children, of course, are the Funks. When Buell Funk dies relatively young of an accident, Helen and 3 of the children will change their names, their surnames from Funk to Muir. So she becomes Helen Muir again. Why didn't the 4th join them? And the reason is that his name was Muir Funk. So if he had changed his name, he would become Muir. So he was the one who, if you'll excuse the expression, demurred. Anyway, this is a picture of the family a little bit later on in life, taken at the mansion. When we do a live presentation, I always ask, what is the dog's name? Here we have the family and the family pooch. What's the dog's name? Well, the answer to that is simple: Stickeen. That's what they called their dog. For the next, he marries Louis, and for the next 8 years are what his fans refer to as his lost years. Dr. Strenzel is in his 70s at this point, and John takes over the management of the ranch, does a wonderful job. The ranch becomes far, far more successful under John, but unfortunately takes a terrible toll on his health. Fortunately, again, he's married to Louis. Louis is a remarkable woman, and she realizes that her husband desperately needs to be in the wilderness, to be in the mountains. And so she is constantly pushing him to go back into the wilderness. When he does that, he will regain his vitality and come back. Now, in 1889, what gets him really writing again is he sees what's happening in Yosemite with the sheep grazing in the valley, destroying everything, them logging it, and he's persuaded to begin writing articles to advocate the preservation of Yosemite. And he's successful, and in 1890, Yosemite will become the 2nd national park after Yellowstone. Now, here's the problem, is Yosemite becomes a park protected by the federal government, but the valley is not included. The state of California maintains control of the valley, and the state of California's idea of the valley is, again, to use it as, to commercialize it as much as possible, to graze it, to log it, and so on. So he will then battle for, the next 16 years to get California to cede control of the valley back to the federal government so it can be protected. In 1892, he'll join with 20 some other very, very influential people to form the Sierra Club. He's elected their first president, and that's a position that he will hold for the next 22 years until his death. Finally, in 1906, the park is complete, and the valley is included in the national park. And now in 1893, he'll take something we don't often think about of John Muir is he was an incredible world traveler. Visited just all over and explored all over the world. In 1893, he takes a trip to Europe. On the way there, he stops by the World's Fair in Chicago. His reaction, quote, a cosmopolitan rat race. He goes on to New York City. Now there, he is wined and dined by people such as Mark Twain, Rudyard Kipling, John Burroughs, many others. He is shocked, utterly shocked to find out that he is a celebrity. Quote, considering how little I have written. So, and by the way, this pattern will go on all of his world travels. No matter where he goes in the world, he is known, he is respected, admired. He's often cajoled into giving lectures, again, on his worldwide travels. In this one, he's headed for England, and the UK. His first objective is Edinburgh and Dunbar. He wants to get in touch with his Scottish roots. When he lands, he says, "I am a Scotchman and at home again." He'll spend 2 weeks in Dunbar, reacquainting himself with childhood friends and getting back there. When he goes to Edinburgh, he's delighted. What does he do in Edinburgh? Same thing I did. My wife and I did the first time we were there. Okay. He's a tourist. He went to Edinburgh Castle. He walked the Royal Mile, went to Arthur's Seat, sailed Loch Ness, etc. Went to the Trossachs. He did what any tourist would do. From there, he goes on to France. Now, remember, he's able to read French scientific journals with no problem. But what he finds is he can't speak the language. No one can understand him, and he can't understand them. He writes, he says, even the dogs don't understand it as I speak it. So I'm now skipping, and this is really sad because time is so short, I have to skip 10 years of his life. But 1903 is one of the most famous years. President Theodore Roosevelt asked John Muir to show him Yosemite. Muir responds, "I'm sorry, I've got something else planned." And Roosevelt makes it clear, "No, you're taking me." So anyway, Muir agrees. They're on a stagecoach to Wawona when Roosevelt finds out that a big banquet is planned and all these events, etc. That's not what he's there for. So Muir and Roosevelt skip out. They jump on horses and they take off for 3 wonderful days where the two of them will camp around Yosemite. Just Muir, well, there's Muir and Roosevelt, and of course some others there. But basically, can you imagine a president of the United States going out and doing that now? The first night they go and they sleep in the Mariposa Grove. They wake up and snow is covering them. You know what Roosevelt's reaction to that was. He wakes up, sees it, and his comment is bully. The most famous picture probably of both of them, certainly John Muir's most famous picture, and probably Roosevelt's as well, taken at Glacier Point as part of their travels. Here's another one I think you'll find wonderful. Here they are at the foot of a giant sequoia. John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt and part of the entourage. Clearly history's most important camping trip. Teddy Roosevelt becomes the great conservationist president we all know him as. He says, "I ask for the preservation of our forests on the grounds of wise and far-sighted economic policy." This is important. We are building this country not for a day. It is to last through the ages. Before TR leaves office, he will protect millions and millions of acres of forest from development. As for Muir, in 1904, he cast the only vote we know in a presidential election, in any election really, and that is for Roosevelt, and we'll send him a telegram afterwards. By the way, just as a little aside, one of the reasons Muir never voted before that is because he only became a naturalized citizen in 1903. He was in his 60s before he even became an American citizen. In 1904, he takes this amazing one-year trip around the world, including taking a train across Siberia, just amazing adventures. In 1905, remember I mentioned that Helen was never well. She became kind of asthmatic. She advised to move to warm climate. So Muir takes her and they begin living in Arizona. There he becomes fascinated by the petrified forest, and he'll lead the movement to have it protected. Unfortunately, the same year, Louis will pass away. 4 years after that, he gets the opportunity to guide another president through Yosemite. This is President Taft. A rather different experience than with Teddy, because Taft is tipping the scales at about 350 pounds at this point. Taft sends a wire back to Washington to let Elijah Root, his Secretary of War, know that he has just completed a horse ride through Yosemite. Secretary Root cables back and said, "How's the horse?" Anyway, but it was an important trip and helped delay the Hetch Hetchy, which we'll talk about in a second, decision. 1911, he'll take a 40,000-mile trip through South America and Africa. He is 73 years old. He'll finally realize part of his dream because he'll go up the Amazon River, 1,000 miles up the Amazon exploring. He'll go down, he'll cross the Andes to Chile, back to Buenos Aires. By the way, along the way, giving lectures to adoring fans, even in South America. From 1907 to 1913 is the epic battle to save Hetch Hetchy. Hetch Hetchy is Yosemite's twin canyon. Equally as beautiful, equally as spectacular, but unfortunately not as accessible, not as well known. And that's an intense battle that Muir and others will wage. Unfortunately, he will lose that fight in 1913. He never recovers from that. A year later, he'll pass away in Los Angeles at age 76. Since then, his legacy has only grown stronger and stronger. So we come first full circle. And that is, if you love Yosemite, if you love the national parks, the national forests, you owe a debt to John Muir, and you need to help keep his dream alive. This is how my family and I do it. Here we are on the top of Half Dome. Here we are with friends from Scotland at Tunnel View. You've got to support our national parks, and you've got to love Yosemite. Anyway, I would be more than happy to answer any questions, but thank you for sharing this with me.
Great job, Garrett. And your impassioned plea to remember John Muir, you did a very good job of explaining why we needed to. Excellent job. Couple things I need to do first is before we get to the questions. I'd like to welcome and thank the Scotts for joining us. Clearly, your fame spreads across the Atlantic. And I'd also like to thank Andrew for his comment on the Strensel Muir home. If you haven't been out to Martinez to see the house, you need to do it. Pick a nice sunny day. It's a lovely site, and I think you'll enjoy it greatly. So, a couple questions. We know of Daniel's religious persuasions. What was John Muir's religious beliefs?
Muir is what we would refer to as spiritual. He believed in God and in Christ, but to him, he eschewed organized religion after his experience, not just with his father, but with when you read his book, My Boyhood and Youth, about experiences he had with other, quote, religious people. To him, there was no need to build a cathedral. God had already built them. Why go worship God in a building when you can do it in this magnificent wilderness? To him, there was long discussions where God is beauty, beauty is God. He and nature. He equates them. To him, they are tautological. They're the same. What is beautiful is godly. So he never, to my knowledge, was engaged in any organized religion, but he was, I think, intensely religious. He carried the New Testament with him. Why? I mean, you say, why would he do that if he'd memorized it? But anyway, he would often have a copy with him. But not, again, he never was, to my knowledge, part of an organized religion.
Did John Muir and Daniel Muir ever sort of reconcile in any way?
The answer, they didn't see each other for many years. After John left the university, he returned home. Their home was near Portage, the farm, and he was there for a while before he left for Canada. And as he was leaving, Daniel says to him, "Haven't you forgotten something?" And Muir says, "What?" And Daniel says, "To pay for your boarding." Um, so Muir didn't see him again until 1885. And there were a couple of odd experiences in Muir's life where he had these weird premonitions. And he had a premonition that his father was dying. So he made a trip back and picked up some of his family, and they went to, I think, Kansas City is where his father was living with one of his daughters. And sure enough, Daniel was on his deathbed, and they kind of reconciled. Daniel apologized for his harsh treatment, and Muir wrote a sort of, I don't want to say loving, that's way too strong, but a kind of an obituary for his father, where he said, under his hard exterior was a loving heart, that sort of thing. So yes, they did reconcile for a very, very brief time, where Daniel was literally on his deathbed.
So staying on Daniel, when he picks up the boys and moves to Wisconsin, when does his mother emigrate to America? How long after that?
Next year.
Next year, okay.
Very soon.
Did Louis accompany him on his trips?
Louis is this remarkable woman. There is no one who could have that Muir could have married that could have been more perfect for him. She is a homebody. She basically never leaves. After she and her family arrive in the Alhambra Valley, that's pretty much where she stays. In 1884, Muir convinces her to join him in Yosemite. It is an absolute disaster. She travels with 4 trunks of clothes. It did not go well. So she very, very rarely would go anywhere with him. But she was responsible. And she was the one who was always pushing him to write his articles. She was the one who recognized that he needed to be in the wilderness. He needed to be in the mountains. And she would be the one that would push him to go. And she also began selling off and leasing portions of the farm so they wouldn't have as much work to do. I mean, she's just a remarkable woman.
So do you think that,
she was also, by the way, a wonderfully accomplished a pianist.
oh,
She's a graduate of Mills College. She's a very, very accomplished woman. She's what we would have called back, a really, really good catch, from a wealthy family.
so do you think that this kind of opposite personality was what the Carrs had in mind when they thought this was a good match?
I don't know. That's a really good question, because there's nothing that when you put the two together, there's really nothing that they have in common. But Jean Carr, she just knew Muir. She knew him so well. She was very good friends with the Strenzels, and she just knew that this was a good match. And I wouldn't say it was love at first sight. Took the boy 5 years to get around to proposing. But anyway, it was perfect.
How about, was he influenced possibly, do you think, by James Hutton when he was in Dunbar?
Well, I know of no connection between the two. Hutton is sort of the reputed father of geology. I may be misstating that. I certainly don't know that much about Hutton, but I know of no connection between the two. It wouldn't have surprised me if he'd read some of his works, but I don't know of any connection.
Okay. How did he see the native population?
The That's a really good question. You have to put that. You have to say what native population and when. When he was in Wisconsin, he did not look on the Winnebagos favorably because the Winnebagos had been displaced from their land, had been put onto reservations. The Indians that he came in contact with there, some of them stole one of his horses. They would beg for food. They were often inebriated, so he did not view them favorably. As he got to know Indians better in his travels, he got to like, I think in many respects, I think he liked Indians a lot better than he liked white people, because he would write how Indians, they would move through the forest and leave no trace. They didn't cut down trees. They didn't, bring in the hooven locusts. They moved silently and quietly. Now, when he was up in Alaska, he again, you have to say, we have to divide them up. The Indians that Native Americans, Eskimos, Inuit, that he came in contact with in Alaska, these were really before any great contact with white men. Basically, there was a preacher there, a minister, a missionary, but and those he had great respect for, and them for him. They gave him an honorary title, and they're the ones who would help him discover Glacier Bay and so on. Now, later, he'll travel with the Coast Guard ship Corwin, and he'll come in contact with other native populations that have had a lot of contact with white men. And those he was not complimentary of, because basically the influence of the white man on the natives was so deleterious and so negative. So again, you have to put it into context when you ask a question like that.
Okay. Since we had problems with that and with that answer, here's a tough one for you.
Uh-oh.
What do you think? I mean, here's a guy very much like Twain and some of the others that you've mentioned, worldwide celebrity, hangs around with TR. What do you think his greatest legacy is?
Well, I mean, I think the easy answer to that is Yosemite.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of a gimme. But more than that, it is, I think, the fact that we owe him such a debt, because he really brought the wilderness to life. He was the one who was constantly leading tours up in Yosemite. Many of the pictures we have of him is where he's literally leading tours of San Franciscans through the valley. But again, the gimme, the easy low hanging fruit would be Yosemite,
Okay.
because but for him, who knows what would have happened there.
True. And I think that's it for questions. Thank you, Garrett. Thanks
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, it's been a blast. I hope that our viewers had as much fun with this as I did. So thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone for viewing this morning. If you missed this program or any part of it, or any of our earlier programs, you can find them by visiting the museum's website at museumsrv.org. Today's program will appear early next week. Our next program will be on Thursday, May the 20th at 11:30. In recognition of Memorial Day, John Mercurio from the Contra Costa Historical Society will tell us the story behind the Pleasant Hill Soldiers Memorial. It's hard to miss. It stands 45 feet high and is literally almost in the middle of Monument Boulevard. We'll hear the story of how it was built, how it arrived at its current location, and some of the controversies that have surrounded it. It's an interesting and entertaining story, and I think you'll enjoy it. If you like these programs and want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's homepage, museumsrv.org, and clicking on the Donate Now button. The museum is also in need of volunteers at its reopening. And if you have some time, please contact the museum. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Stay safe, and thank you for watching.